Welcome to Academic Writing, Grammar and Rhetoric, a course in the Masters of Arts in Carnival Studies. In this module, we will discuss three things: why we write, what to write, and the basic elements of an argument. After you complete this module, you should have a better understanding of our expectations of you as a graduate student and academic writer or researcher, and have a clearer idea of what you want to write about. Every time we move up an academic rung, we encounter new writing challenges and requirements. It doesn't mean we were bad before, but writing a solid A-level or CAPE essay is a far different from writing a good undergraduate essay, which is a far cry from writing a graduate level essay. The key shift isn't so much language or structure as it is the function of our writing. We are making the shift from expository to argumentative, from showing how much we've read to challenging what we've read or heard. The first hurdle often is deciding on a topic. We are no longer given paper topics, far less any such direction for writing a thesis or dissertation. How do we come up with a viable topic? The simplest place to start is with your own interests. What are you drawn to? What fascinates you and why? What is it about Shakespeare's Hamlet, or Sparrow's music, or Bailey's vision? Is it a pinnable, mappable thing? Is it an important thing outside of your own interests? Is it a thing everyone should know about or be discussing? Note, I said simplest place to start. As a postgraduate researcher and writer, you will take your interest and embed it in the discourse. Put another way, as a researcher, you will engage the discourse, define a problem, and state and defend a position. So the shift we talked about is you, as a writer, entering the discipline's discourse. Our intention and function is to expand this discourse. Every discipline has both a lingua franca and a complex conversation being carried out in that lingua franca. This conversation in the academic lingua franca is called discourse. Embedded in the word is an assumption that each participant is presenting an argument or position in an ongoing conversation. Before we begin to write, we must be knowledgeable of the major arguments in a discourse. We should bear in mind too that discourses have a tree-like structure. The trunk represents the topic. Each branch represents a position taken on that subject, and so on. The roots may well represent the cultural, social, and ideological assumptions that feed into the topic. It is imperative, then, that before we engage in any discourse, that we identify what are the major limbs and what are the twigs. In a graduate school, we often rely on our classes to show us some of these limbs. Once we know the discourse, we can return to that intellectual discomfort, most likely sharpened by the general direction of the discourse. Identify a topic that interests you and the discourse around that topic. Does it mesh with your understanding of the topic? Is something missing? When you find yourself at odds with an aspect of the discourse, you are identifying a problem or problematizing the discourse. There are three main problems you can identify. There is no discourse. This could mean that a topic has been completely overlooked or has not been researched enough. This is especially problematic when the topic you are interested in has generated other topics with viable discourses. The discourse has gotten it all wrong. This could mean that the discourse is wrongly premised to begin with. For example, applying a theory applicable to another topic but not to yours, or misreading the topic based on cultural chauvinism or insensitivity. The discourse has gotten it right but could go much further. This is often true when a discourse identifies a key characteristic, issue, or argument about a topic but does not examine the roots of the topic or go far enough in detailing the how and why. For example, many would argue that carnival is ritualistic, but many do not hone in on the forms of ritual enacted during carnival. Identifying the problem usually points us in a particular direction or tack, guiding our project and determining what we would focus on in our writing. In other words, we are writing to solve this problem. Also, identifying the problem usually generates our thesis. Our focus becomes correcting or addressing the problem through research and argumentation. At this point, it is imperative that we actively pre-write. First, we must determine where we stand. While research can be exploratory, we need a rudder to steer us. We should therefore have a position in mind. This is both based on and partially defined by the problem we identify. Of course, this position is not rigid. We must allow for shifts in direction based on what we encounter. It is also more nuanced than a simple pro, con, for, against binary of argumentation. For example, say you've identified that the problem is a gap in the knowledge or discourse. Saying the gap needs to be filled is not a position. Providing the reason the gap exists and suggesting how the gap could be filled add up to your position. So you have identified the problem. You have identified your position. Now, what do you write? Well, before you put pen to paper, there are two more areas you should contemplate. Who is your audience? Who are you writing to or for? And what would make you credible? Knowing your audience is important because it helps you determine your argumentation strategy. You need to determine the assumptions you can rely on and those you need to counter. Are you culturally similar to your audience? This generally means that you will have been acculturated similarly. There will be ideologies, biases, and other assumptions you share. What should they know already? If they are culturally similar to you, certain cultural concepts would be common knowledge. You do not need to explain these commonalities. So what do you need to explain? If they are not culturally similar, if you are addressing a completely or partially uninitiated audience, you will need to define terms common to you but uncommon to them. Whether you are from the same general culture or not, there may be assumptions, biases, and ideologies that you disagree with or challenge in your argument. Therefore, you must identify if there are shared assumptions you are arguing against, especially if the discourse has gotten it wrong, quote unquote. You will find your audience may hold firm to the quote unquote wrong assumptions. If you are using terms differently to the cultural lexicon, it helps if you establish how you are using a term differently from what most people expect. For example, Clinton's redefinition of sex during the Lewinsky scandal. Understanding your audience is vital because the more resistant your audience, the more assumptions you have to address. The more work you need to do to persuade your audience that your position is, at the very least, viable. So, will your audience be completely resistant? The most work defining, proving, persuading your audience? Somewhat resistant? Somewhat compliant? Or completely compliant, which is a walk in the park and probably not much of an argument to begin with. The thing to remember is that the level of resistance equals the level of persuasion required. As you are addressing your audience's assumptions, you must also assure your audience that you are a credible, objective source of information. There are 3 things to consider here. Generally speaking, the first impression you make as a writer is the basic text. Before a reader can assess your content, he or she encounters the written word. So the first assurance of your credibility is your command of the language. Do not let your punctuation, sentence structures, simple, compound, complex, and so on, formatting, especially if there are industrial guidelines, and spelling obscure your meaning. These elements are distracting to say the least. They suggest right off the bat your discipline as a writer and your respect for the intelligence of your audience. In other words, before you even state your position or acknowledge your audience's assumptions, this little courtesy of writing well lessens audience resistance. We expect that a researcher has done exactly that, researched. You should therefore be able to identify sources and the controversies around them. Do not rely on lazy phrases such as "some may say" or "others have argued." At the graduate level, we expect you to be able to name the major movers and shakers in the discourse. Also, if you are doing primary research, you must acknowledge that your interviewees, focus groups, and informants will be biased. You must therefore back up your sources with supporting data, secondary texts, and as objective as possible external sources. Remember, take nothing at face value. Not only do your sources have biases, but you do as well. So, know your biases. Know your relationship to your subject. Are you emic, inside the culture, or etic, outside the culture? I should make it clear that culture here is a shortcut for all cultural strata, from global to individual. Address your bias. This is particularly important if you are passionate about your subject. You do not want your emotions to blind you to discrepancies or inconsistencies in your work. Just because you wish it to be so does not make it so. You definitely do not want your audience to recognize your bias through your writing either. That would be disastrous to your credibility. At this point, You are almost ready to put your first mark on a page. Before you do, however, let us examine the basic types and elements of any argument. There are three types of arguments, broadly speaking: one-sided, multi-sided, and dialogic. A one-sided argument is the narrowest form of argumentation. You only address your argument or position. You do not address other positions, even if you are contrary to some of them. Thus, a one-sided argument has a very narrow focus. This may be useful, however, if you want to prove a stance's viability. You are not replacing one stance with another, simply showing that your position is possible. For example, showing that the discourse can go further in a particular direction. Multi-sided arguments, therefore, are more of a debate. With a multi-sided argument, you provide your argument and a summary of the opposing argument, especially useful if you are suggesting that the discourse has gone astray. More importantly, a multi-sided argument makes you seem more even-keeled and aware of the discourse. You also have the option of a dialogic argument, which has a stronger component of inquiry. It is more exploratory, and your audience may arrive at a position in the end. Even so, you may be leaning more to one side than the other. Remember, you will have biases and preconceived notions. You are human after all. And now for the major element of your argument, your thesis statement, also called your research statement or hypothesis. Whatever type of argument you choose, you must have a thesis statement. In a nutshell, your thesis statement is your legend. It makes your paper mappable and easier to follow. If you start with a clear thesis statement, giving your position, your audience's expectations are pointed in a particular direction. Each subsequent section, paragraph, or chapter becomes a stop on that intellectual journey. For your thesis statement to function as a legend or key to your intellectual C-chart, you should pay attention to the two main components: the claim and the enthemy. The first part of your argument is the claim. It is akin to a pronouncement. For example, consider the following claims. Violent video games should be age restricted. The legal drinking age should be raised. For a claim to be viable, you should have data to back it up. So pay attention to evidence sufficiency when making your claim. Is there enough evidence to support your claim? Particularly important depending on the type of claim you make. There are two types of claims. Strong claim is one that needs much evidence to support. It is an all or nothing claim. For example, all boys prefer blue to pink. If even one boy prefers pink over blue, your claim is disproved. Or a qualified claim. Such a claim allows for anomalies in the data. For example, the majority of boys prefer blue to pink. This is easier to support because examples to the contrary do not disprove your claim altogether. Part of your thesis statement is the enthemy. An enthemy is an incomplete logical structure dependent on an underlying assumption or premise that must be accepted by the audience. An enthemy is usually the reason supporting your claim. In the following examples, the bold text is the enthemy. So violent video games should be age restricted because young children will imitate the violence. The legal drinking age should be raised to reduce drunk driving fatalities. Supporting your enthemy are your grounds, examples, evidence, and supporting arguments. Underlying both claim and enthemy are your warrants. Real-world arguments or oppositions are based, at least in part, on beliefs or views that are usually unstated in the arguments themselves. These assumptions are culturally motivated, influenced by personal and national histories and ideologies. When the audience shares these assumptions, the argument is convincing. If the audience does not share these assumptions, the argument is infinitely less so. It is in assessing your warrants that you consider your audience. What are your shared assumptions and beliefs? Unshared assumptions or sources of discord. If this sounds repetitive, it is only meant to stress how important knowing your audience and your assumptions actually is in argumentative writing. Let us examine our examples and identify the warrants. Violent video games should be age restricted because young children will imitate the violence. To make this argument, we assume that we as a society dislike violence, and that children are innocent and impressionable. The legal drinking age should be raised to reduce drunk driving fatalities. The underlying assumptions are that there is a link between age, maturity, and consumption of alcohol, that there is a link between age, maturity, and driving skills. For both examples, you would provide backing, support for the warrant or underlying assumptions. While the warrant is not stated in your argument, you will provide evidence and supporting arguments related to your assumptions. For example, you may cite statistics showing that DUIs are more prevalent in the teenage driving population, or data on the effects of alcohol on the adolescent mind. You may even have to define maturity based on biological development, age, as maturity is otherwise quite subjective. Remember, and I cannot stress this enough, it is your responsibility to counter audience resistance when making your argument. Thank you for your attention. This is the end of Module 1. Before you go, what other assumptions can you identify for the two examples? Do you agree or disagree with any of them? Let us discuss this online through Canvas.